The thorns bit deeper into Zelda Morgan's palms as she twisted another prickly pear fruit free from the cactus. Her fingertips, already stained crimson from where the tiny glotches had pierced through the thin cotton of her worn gloves. She had been out in the Utah desert since dawn, filling her canvas sack with the purple fruit that would become jam, pennies at a time, in a town that had little use for a woman alone. It was 1883, and Circleville was not kind to those without family or fortune. She wiped the sweat from her brow with her forearm, careful not to touch her face with her punctured hands, and surveyed the landscape that stretched endlessly before her. The red rock formations rose like ancient sentinels in the distance, and the sage dotted the sandy earth between the prickly pear patches she had been harvesting since sunup. Her back ached, her throat was parched despite the canteen she had brought, and the August sun beat down with merciless intensity. But she needed the money. The boarding house where she rented a single room cost $3 a week, and Mrs. Henderson had been making pointed comments about payment being due. Zelda had arrived in Circleville 3 months ago on the stage from Salt Lake City, carrying everything she owned in a single carpet bag, and nursing a broken heart that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the death of her mother. The consumption had taken Martha Morgan slowly, expensively, and with cruel efficiency. By the time her mother had drawn her last breath, Zelda was 22 years old, alone in the world and completely penniless. A distant cousin in Circleville had written once, years ago, mentioning that the town was growing and opportunities existed for hardworking people. It was thin hope, but it was all Zelda had. The reality was harsher than the letter had suggested. The cousin had moved on to California, and Circleville was a small Mormon settlement with suspicious eyes for outsiders. Zelda was not Mormon, not married, and not particularly skilled at anything the town valued. She could read and write, had a good head for figures, and possessed her mother's recipe for prickly pear jam that had been a favorite at church socials back in St. Louis. That recipe had become her lifeline. She sold the jam to the general store for pennies per jar, barely enough to cover her room and food, let alone save anything for the uncertain future. Every fruit she harvested came at a price paid in blood and pain, but Zelda had learned that survival often did. Another fruit twisted free, and she hissed as a particularly vicious thorn drove through her glove entirely. She pulled her hand back and examined the damage. The glove was beyond repair now, torn through at the thumb. She stripped it off and tossed it aside, continuing with her bare hand. It would bleed more, but the gloves were doing little good anyway. The sun had climbed higher when she heard the horse approaching. Zelda straightened, one hand instinctively moving to the small knife at her belt. A woman alone in the desert was vulnerable in ways she tried not to think about too carefully. She shaded her eyes with her less damaged hand and watched as the rider crested a small rise. He was tall in the saddle, sitting easy on a bay gelding that looked well cared for and strong. As he drew closer, Zelda could make out more details. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun, a dusty blue shirt and chaps that had seen hard use. A rope hung coiled on his saddle, and she could see the glint of spurs at his heels. A cowboy, then. Probably riding for one of the ranches that sprawled across the territory, pushing cattle across the endless miles of scrubland. He pulled up several yards away, and Zelda straightened her spine, trying to look less vulnerable than she felt. Her sack was perhaps 2/3 full, and she calculated quickly whether she could outrun a man on horseback if she needed to. The answer was no. "Morning, miss." His voice was deep and carried easily across the space between them. He pushed his hat back slightly, and she caught sight of dark hair and a face that was sun-weathered but young. Perhaps 25, she guessed, maybe 26. Morning. Zelda kept her voice level, polite but not inviting. He swung down from his saddle with the easy grace of someone who had been riding since childhood and took a few steps closer, leading his horse. That was when he seemed to notice her hands. His eyes, she saw now that he was closer, were a striking hazel color, green and brown and gold all mixed together. Those eyes widened slightly as he took in the blood on her fingers, the torn gloves discarded nearby, and the sack of prickly pear fruit. "Madam, your hands." It was not quite a question, more an observation layered with concern. Zelda glanced down at her palms, seeing them as he must see them. They were a mess of small punctures, some still bleeding, others already starting to swell where the tiny barbed glotches had embedded themselves. Her fingertips were stained purple from the fruit, making the whole thing look even worse than it was. "They are fine," she said, which was a lie but a necessary one. "Just thorns." "Just thorns," he repeated, and there was something in his tone that made her look up sharply. Not mockery exactly, but a kind of gentle disbelief. "You have been picking prickly pear." "Obviously." She gestured to her sack. "All morning." He looked at the sun, calculating as she had done earlier, since dawn. He was quiet for a moment, studying her with those unusual eyes. She felt herself bristle under the scrutiny, ready to defend herself against whatever judgment was coming. She had heard plenty in Circleville. People thought she was foolish, desperate, shameful for doing such work. The Mormon women in town made jam from prickly pear too, but they sent their children or husbands to harvest the fruit, wearing thick leather gloves and using long tongs. They thought Zelda was either too stupid or too proud to ask for help. The truth was simpler and more complicated. She had no one to ask. "What do you do with them?" he asked instead. "The fruit. I make jam, sell it to the general store in Circleville." He nodded slowly, taking this in. Then he did something that surprised her. He walked back to his horse and retrieved a canteen, bringing it over and holding it out to her. "You look like you could use some water." Zelda hesitated. There were rules about taking things from strangers, about creating obligations that could be called in later. But her canteen had run dry an hour ago, and her throat was so dry it hurt to swallow. She took the canteen with a nod of thanks and drank carefully, trying not to gulp despite how desperately she wanted to. The water was cool and clean, tasting faintly of metal from the canteen, but better than anything she could remember. She drank enough to ease the worst of her thirst, then handed it back. "Thank you. You are welcome." He took a drink himself, then hung the canteen back on his saddle before returning. "I am Ryder Bennett. I work for the Broken Arrow Ranch about 15 miles south of here." Zelda Morgan. She did not offer her hand, both because of the blood and because she was not entirely sure of the propriety. "Miss Morgan." He tipped his hat slightly. "Can I ask what the general store pays you for your jam?" The question caught her off guard. "I do not see how that is your concern." "Maybe it is not," he agreed easily. "But humor me anyway." She frowned at him, trying to understand his angle. Men did not usually ask women about money unless they were husbands, fathers, or planning to be one of the two. But there was something genuine in his expression, a straightforward curiosity that did not seem predatory. 2 cents per jar," she said finally. "I provide the jars and the labor. He provides the shelf space and takes the risk that it will not sell." Ryder whistled low. 2 cents. "How much fruit does it take to make a jar?" "About 2 pounds of fruit makes 1 jar after cooking down." He looked at her sack, then at her hands, then back at her face. "So you spent the morning bleeding in the desert for maybe 20 cents worth of jam." When he put it like that, It sounded even more pathetic than it was. Zelda felt her cheeks flush with shame and anger. I do what I must. Not all of us have the luxury of riding for a ranch and drawing a steady wage. I meant no offense, he said quickly, and she could hear the truth in his words. I am just trying to understand. Why does the store pay so little? Because he can. Because I need the money more than I need my pride. Because there are not many other options for a woman alone in this town. The words came out more bitter than she had intended, and she bit her lip, wishing she could take them back. But Ryder did not look scandalized or uncomfortable with her honesty. Instead, he looked thoughtful. The Broken Arrow has a cookhouse that feeds 30 men 3 times a day. Cookie makes a lot of his own preserves and such, but he is always complaining about not having enough variety. The men get tired of the same things over and over. Zelda waited, not sure where this was going. How much jam could you make if you had, say, 50 pounds of prickly pear fruit? She did the calculation quickly. About 25 jars if the fruit is good quality. And how much would you need to charge per jar to make it worth your time and the cost of supplies? This was dangerous territory. If she named a price too high, he would laugh and ride away. Too low, and she would be cheating herself. She thought about the hours of work, the cost of sugar and jars, the wood for the fire to cook everything down, and the tiny room she could barely afford. 20 cents per jar, she said, her heart pounding. That would be a fair price. She waited for him to laugh or shake his head and ride away. Instead, Ryder pulled off his own gloves and held out his right hand to her. You have got a deal, Miss Morgan. I will bring you 50 pounds of prickly pear fruit, picked clean and ready to cook. You make me 25 jars of jam and I will pay you $5. Zelda stared at him, certain she had misheard. $5. That was more than 6 weeks of her current income. That was the difference between hunger and security, between desperation and hope. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Ryder's expression softened. Because Cookie needs the jam, because the Broken Arrow can afford it, and because no one should have to tear their hands apart for pennies. Do we have a deal? Slowly, despite the blood and the pain, Zelda reached out and shook his hand. His grip was firm but careful, mindful of her injuries. We have a deal, Mr. Bennett. Ryder, he corrected. If we are going to be doing business together, might as well be on friendly terms. Ryder, she repeated, testing the name. And you may call me Zelda. He smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face into something approaching handsome. Well then, Zelda, how about you let me take you back to town? You can pick up that sack later. Right now, you need to get those hands cleaned up before they get infected. She wanted to argue, to insist that she was fine and could manage on her own. But the truth was that her hands were throbbing, her back ached, and the thought of walking the 3 miles back to Circleville in the heat made her want to weep. So instead she nodded. Thank you. Ryder helped her up onto his horse, which was an experience in itself. She had ridden before, but always side saddle and always on much tamer animals. The gelding danced slightly under the unfamiliar weight, but Ryder steadied him with a quiet word and a hand on his neck. Then he swung up behind her, reaching around to take the reins. Hold on, he said, and Zelda gripped the saddle horn with her least damaged hand. They rode in silence for the first mile, Zelda acutely aware of the man at her back, the warmth of him in the saddle, the easy way he controlled the horse. It was both uncomfortable and oddly comforting. She had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be taken care of, even in such a small way. So what brought you to Circleville? Ryder asked eventually, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the horse's hooves. My mother died. I had nowhere else to go. The words were blunt, but there was no point in dressing them up. Death was a common enough companion in 1883. I am sorry, that must have been hard. It was. She paused, then added, she had consumption. It took 2 years. My father died of consumption, Ryder said quietly. When I was 16, I understand how it goes. There was something in his voice that made Zelda turn her head slightly to look at him. His expression was distant, remembering. It is a cruel disease, that it is. He seemed to shake off the memory. Your mother taught you to make the jam. Yes. She learned from her mother, who learned from hers. It is an old recipe, passed down. My grandmother was Mexican, and she knew all about working with prickly pear and other desert plants. My mother was Mexican, Ryder said, and there was warmth in his voice now. From Chihuahua originally. She married my father against her family's wishes and moved north with him. She died when I was 12. Fever took her. I am sorry. Long time ago now. But she could hear that it still hurt, in the way that losing a mother always hurt no matter how much time passed. They rode in companionable silence after that, and Zelda found herself relaxing slightly. Ryder Bennett was easy to be around, she realized. He did not press her with questions or make assumptions. He simply was, solid and steady, a presence that felt safe in a way she had not experienced in a long time. Circleville appeared on the horizon, a cluster of buildings huddled together, as if for protection against the vastness of the landscape. It was not a large town, maybe 300 people all told, but it had the basics. A general store, a church, a school, a boarding house, a blacksmith, and a scattering of homes. The Mormons who had settled here were hard-working people, and it showed in the tidy streets and well-maintained buildings. Ryder rode straight down the main street, seemingly unconcerned with the stares they were attracting. Zelda felt the weight of those stares, the curiosity and judgment in equal measure. She could already hear the gossip that would follow. Zelda Morgan, that strange girl who lives at the boarding house, riding through town on a cowboy's horse, covered in blood and sitting far too close to a man she was not married to. Let them talk. She needed the money more than she needed their approval. Ryder stopped in front of the general store. I will help you down. He dismounted first, then reached up to help her. His hands were gentle on her waist, lifting her down as if she weighed nothing. For a moment they stood very close, and Zelda could smell horse and leather and something that was uniquely him, clean sweat and sage. Thank you for the ride. She stepped back, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. I will be back in 3 days with your fruit, he said. Where should I bring it? The boarding house, I suppose. Mrs. Henderson has a kitchen I can use if I pay her a little extra. He nodded. The boarding house in 3 days. I will see you then, Zelda. She watched him ride away, her hands throbbing in time with her heartbeat, her mind already calculating how she would manage to make 25 jars of jam in the small boarding house kitchen without annoying Mrs. Henderson beyond reason. But underneath, the practical concerns was something else, something she had not felt in a long time: hope. Mrs. Henderson was less than pleased about the state of Zelda's hands. The older woman, a sturdy Mormon wife whose husband had died in a mining accident 5 years prior, took one look at the bloody mess and marched Zelda straight to the kitchen. Sit, she commanded, pointing to a chair by the table. Zelda sat. Mrs. Henderson brought a basin of water, a clean cloth, tweezers, and a bottle of something that smelled strongly of alcohol. For the next hour, she meticulously cleaned Zelda's hands, using the tweezers to remove the tiny glotches embedded in her skin. It hurt worse than the original injury, each pull of the tweezers sending a sharp sting through already damaged flesh. You are a fool, girl, Mrs. Henderson said, but her hands were gentle. Going out there without proper equipment trying to harvest prickly pear like this. I needed the money. There are other ways to earn money that do not involve bleeding all over my clean floors. Zelda bit back a sharp retort. She had looked for other work. The town did not need a schoolteacher, they had no use for a seamstress, and the few other jobs available had been given to Mormon women with families and connections. She had applied everywhere and been turned away politely but firmly. The jam was all she had, but Mrs. Henderson surprised her. "That cowboy who brought you back, Ryder Bennett, I think his name is, he asked after you at the store once few weeks back." Zelda's head jerked up. "What?" "Asked who was making the prickly pear jam that Carson had on his shelves. Carson told him it was you, Mrs. Henderson dipped the cloth in the water, wringing it out. "Ryder bought 2 jars, said it was the best jam he had ever tasted and asked if there would be more." "I did not know that. Carson did not tell you because he is a skinflint who does not want you knowing that your jam sells." Mrs. Henderson's mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "He has been selling it for 10 cents a jar and telling you it barely moves, but I have seen people buy it. It is popular." The betrayal stung, though Zelda supposed she should not have been surprised. Carson at the general store had never been particularly kind to her. She was competition to his wife's preserves, and he had made it clear from the start that he was doing her a favor by taking her jam at all. "Ryder offered me work," Zelda said quietly. "He wants 25 jars for the Broken Arrow Ranch. He is paying me $5. Mrs. Henderson's hand stilled on the tweezers. $5. "Yes, madam. That is good money for jam." The older woman resumed her work, pulling out another glotchid. "That is fair money." He said no one should have to tear their hands apart for pennies. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The Bennetts are good people. Ryder's father was white, his mother Mexican. She was a lovely woman, died too young. Ryder grew up half in both worlds and seems to have taken the best from each. Works hard, treats people fair, does not put on airs. If he says he will pay you $5, he will pay you $5. Something in Mrs. Henderson's tone made Zelda look up. The older woman was watching her with an expression that was hard to read. "You like him," Zelda said, surprised. "I respect him," Mrs. Henderson corrected. "There is a difference, though I suppose I do like him well enough. He helped my son last winter when the boy got himself lost in a storm. Rode out in weather that could have killed him and brought Samuel home safe. I will not forget that." She finished with the tweezers and began wrapping Zelda's hands in clean strips of cloth. "You keep these bandages on until the wounds start to heal. Change them daily and keep them clean. I will give you some salve to put on before you rewrap, and you will not be harvesting any more prickly pear with your bare hands, understand?" "Yes, madam." "Good." Mrs. Henderson tied off the last bandage with a firm knot. "Now, about using my kitchen to make 25 jars of jam. I will let you use it for $1 and 10% of whatever you make beyond what you owe the cowboy. That way, if you find more customers, I benefit from providing the space." It was more than fair. Zelda had expected Mrs. Henderson to demand at least $2 and possibly more. "That is generous." "I am not generous," Mrs. Henderson said briskly. "I am practical. You having steady work means you can pay your rent on time, which benefits me. And if that jam is as good as people say, having some for myself is not a hardship. Do we have an agreement?" "Yes, madam, we do." "Then go rest. Those hands need time to heal before you can do any work." Zelda went upstairs to her small room, her hands throbbing but her heart lighter than it had been in months. She lay on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about hazel eyes and a gentle voice, about $5, and the possibility of more work to come. She thought about the way Ryder had looked at her hands with concern rather than judgment, the way he had offered her water without expecting anything in return. She thought about hope, that dangerous, precious thing. 3 days later, Zelda was standing in the kitchen of the boarding house when she heard a wagon pull up outside. Her hands were better, though still tender, and she had spent the previous day preparing everything she would need for jam making. Jars cleaned and ready, sugar measured out, her mother's old copper pot polished until it gleamed. She stepped out onto the porch and felt her breath catch. Ryder Bennett was climbing down from a wagon loaded with crates, but it was not just him. There was another man with him, older, with gray shot through his dark hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent his entire life outdoors. "Zelda," Ryder called, spotting her. "Got your fruit. This is Mateo Reyes, foreman at the Broken Arrow." "Mateo, this is Zelda Morgan, the woman I told you about." Mateo tipped his hat to her. "Miss Morgan, Ryder says you make the finest prickly pear jam this side of the territory." "I do my best," Zelda said, coming down the steps. "He also says you were picking fruit with your bare hands and bleeding all over the desert." There was no judgment in Mateo's voice, only a kind of gruff concern. "That true? It was necessary at the time." "Well, it is not necessary anymore." Mateo gestured to the wagon. "We brought you more than 50 pounds. Closer to 75, I would say. Figured you might want extra for your own purposes. And we brought you these." He reached into the wagon and pulled out a pair of thick leather gloves, the kind designed specifically for handling cactus. They were well made and had clearly been used but were still in good condition. "I cannot afford," Zelda started. "They are mine," Mateo interrupted. "My wife made me new ones for my birthday last month, so these are just taking up space. You would be doing me a favor by taking them off my hands." It was a lie, a kind one, and they all knew it, but Zelda found herself reaching out to accept the gloves anyway. "Thank you, that is very generous." "Not generous, practical." Mateo exchanged a glance with Ryder that Zelda could not quite read. "Now, where do you want these crates?" Between the three of them, they unloaded the fruit into Mrs. Henderson's kitchen. The older woman appeared halfway through, took one look at the massive quantity of prickly pear, and raised her eyebrows but said nothing. When the last crate was in place, Ryder brushed off his hands and turned to Zelda. "That should keep you busy for a while. A while indeed." She looked at the mountain of fruit, already calculating how long it would take to process it all. Days, certainly, maybe a week if she worked carefully. "I will have your jam ready in about a week if that suits. Take whatever time you need. We are in no rush." He paused, then added, "If you need any help, or if anything comes up, the Broken Arrow is about 2 hours' ride south along the main road. You cannot miss it." "I will be fine," Zelda said, though the offer warmed her. Mateo and Ryder took their leave, climbing back onto the wagon. But before they could drive away, Mrs. Henderson came out onto the porch. "Mr. Bennett," she called. Ryder pulled up. "Yes, madam." "You and Mr. Reyes will join us for dinner tonight, 6 o'clock. I will not take no for an answer." For a moment Ryder looked surprised. Then he smiled. "We would be honored, Mrs. Henderson. 6 o'clock. As the wagon rolled away, Zelda turned to Mrs. Henderson with wide eyes. "You invited them to dinner." "I did. They did us a good turn, bringing all that fruit and those gloves. The least we can do is feed them a decent meal." Mrs. Henderson fixed Zelda with a knowing look. "Besides, I want to get a better measure of that cowboy." Any man who goes to such trouble for a woman he barely knows is either very kind or has ulterior motives. "I intend to find out which." "Mrs. Henderson, do not argue with me, girl. Go wash your face and put on your good dress. We have company coming, and I will not have them thinking I run a slovenly establishment." Dinner that evening was a surprisingly pleasant affair. Mrs. Henderson had outdone herself, producing fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and a dried apple pie that made Mateo close his eyes in appreciation after the first bite. Mrs. Henderson, if you ever tire of running a boarding house, you could find work as a cook anywhere in the territory, he said, the older woman's cheeks flushed with pleasure. You are too kind, Mr. Reyes. Not kind, honest. Mateo took another bite of pie. My wife is an excellent cook, but even she would be impressed by this. They ate at the long table in the dining room, the four of them, with Mrs. Henderson at the head as befitted the mistress of the house. Zelda had indeed put on her good dress, a serviceable gray cotton that had been her mother's before the consumption had wasted her away to nothing. It was too big in the shoulders and too loose at the waist, but it was clean and pressed, and it was the best she had. Ryder, she noticed, had also cleaned up. His hair was still damp from washing, and he wore a clean shirt that looked relatively new. He sat across from her at the table, and she found herself acutely aware of him, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the sound of his laugh when Mateo told a story about a particularly stubborn bull. So, Zelda, Mateo said, settling back in his chair after finishing his second helping of pie, Ryder tells me you came from St. Louis. That is a long way from Circleville. It is. My mother and I took the train to Salt Lake City, then the stage down here. It took nearly 2 weeks all told. And what made you choose Circleville? Mateo's tone was friendly, curious rather than interrogating. I had a cousin who lived here once. She had written that the town was growing and there were opportunities. By the time I arrived, she had moved on, but I had spent what little money we had on the journey. There was nothing to do but stay and make the best of it. That takes courage, Ryder said quietly. Zelda met his eyes across the table. Or desperation. Sometimes they look similar. Often they are the same thing, Mrs. Henderson said. Courage without necessity is just showing off. Real courage is doing what must be done even when you are terrified. You sound like you speak from experience, Mateo observed. I came west with my husband 30 years ago. Left everything I knew in New York and traveled across the country in a wagon train, 9 months pregnant with my first child. Lost that baby on the trail, had 2 more after we arrived, and buried my husband 5 years ago when a mine shaft collapsed on him. If that is not courage born of necessity, I do not know what is. There was a moment of respectful silence. Then Mateo raised his water glass. To courage, then, wherever we find it. They all raised their glasses and drank. The conversation flowed more easily after that. Mateo spoke about the broken arrow, about the owner, a man named Harrison Fletcher who had come west from Philadelphia and built the ranch from nothing. Ryder talked about the cattle, about the long drives north to the rail lines, about the land that seemed to stretch on forever under the wide Utah sky. Zelda found herself talking about her mother, about the recipes and traditions passed down through generations, about the grandmother she had never met but whose blood ran in her veins, teaching her hands how to work with the prickly pear even without formal instruction. My mother used to say that food was a way of keeping the past alive, she said. Every time I make the jam, I am remembering her and her mother and all the women who came before. It is like they are still here, guiding my hands. That is beautiful, Ryder said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up. He was watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something soft and intent at the same time. Mrs. Henderson stood, breaking the moment. Well, gentlemen, I am sure you have a long ride back to the ranch. Thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you at my table. Mateo and Ryder rose, thanking her profusely for the meal, At the door, Ryder turned back to Zelda. "Good luck with the jam. I am sure it will be excellent. I will do my best not to disappoint you. You could not disappoint me if you tried." He said it simply, as a statement of fact, then tipped his hat and followed Mateo out into the gathering darkness. Zelda stood on the porch and watched them ride away, her heart doing complicated things in her chest that she tried very hard not to analyze. "That cowboy is sweet on you," Mrs. Henderson said from behind her. Zelda jumped. "He is not. He is just being kind." "There is kind, and then there is the way he looks at you like you hung the moon. That is something else entirely." Mrs. Henderson crossed her arms. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "Nothing. I am going to do nothing. I am going to make his jam, take his money, and be grateful for the work. That is all. If you say so." But Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested she did not believe a word of it. The next week was a blur of work. Zelda rose before dawn each day and went straight to the kitchen, where she spent hours processing prickly pear fruit. The process was time-consuming and required care. First, she had to carefully wash the fruit, removing any remaining glotches. Then she peeled them, revealing the sweet purple flesh inside. The flesh went into her copper pot with sugar and a little water, and she cooked it down slowly, stirring constantly to prevent burning. The kitchen filled with steam and the sweet, distinctive smell of prickly pear. Mrs. Henderson drifted in and out, occasionally offering advice or a glass of water, but mostly leaving Zelda to her work. On the third day, the first jars came out of their water bath, sealed perfectly, the jam inside a deep, jewel-like purple. By the end of the week, Zelda had 25 jars for the broken arrow, another 15 jars from the extra fruit they had brought her, and hands that were stained purple to the wrist. She lined up the jars on the kitchen table, admiring her work. Each jar was perfect, sealed tight, the jam inside thick and rich and exactly the right consistency. She had done it. Mrs. Henderson came in to inspect the results and nodded approvingly. "That is fine work, Zelda. Very fine work indeed. I will take my share now if you do not mind." Zelda gave her 2 jars per their agreement, and Mrs. Henderson immediately opened one to taste it. Her eyes widened. "Oh, that is good. That is better than good. You said your grandmother's recipe?" "Yes, madam." "Well, your grandmother knew what she was doing." Mrs. Henderson regarded the remaining jars thoughtfully. "You know, I have been thinking. My son runs a restaurant in Beaver, about 30 miles north of here. He is always looking for interesting things to serve. I wonder if he might be interested in buying some of your jam." Zelda's heart leaped. "Do you really think so? I think it is worth asking. I will write him a letter, send him a jar to taste. We will see what he says." Mrs. Henderson smiled, a rare expression that transformed her stern face. "You have a gift, girl. About time you started getting paid what it is worth." That afternoon, a rider arrived with a message. Ryder would come by the following day to collect the jam and bring payment. Zelda spent the evening carefully packing the 25 jars into crates, padding them with straw to prevent breakage. She tried not to think about seeing Ryder again, tried not to let herself feel excited about it. She failed spectacularly. He arrived mid-morning, alone this time, riding the same bay gelding. Zelda watched from the kitchen window as he dismounted, tied his horse to the rail, and climbed the steps to the porch. She smoothed down her apron, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and tried to calm her racing heart. This was business. Just business. She opened the door before he could knock. "Good morning." "Good morning, Zelda." His smile was warm, genuine. "How did it go? Come see for yourself." She led him into the kitchen, where the crates of jam waited on the table. Ryder whistled low when he saw them, the same way he had whistled when she had told him what the general store paid. That is a lot of jam. 25 jars, as requested, each one sealed properly and filled to the correct level. They should last for at least a year if stored in a cool, dark place. Ryder picked up one of the jars, holding it up to the light. The jam glowed purple in the sun streaming through the window, beautiful and inviting. May I taste it, of course? Zelda found a clean spoon and opened one of the extra jars she had kept aside. She dipped the spoon in and handed it to him. Ryder tasted the jam carefully, and Zelda found herself holding her breath. His opinion mattered more than it should, more than was wise. She watched his face, trying to read his reaction, his eyes closed. "Oh, is it all right?" she asked anxiously. "All right." He opened his eyes and looked at her with something like wonder. "Zelda, this is amazing. This is better than the jam I bought from the store. What did you do differently?" "I used fresh fruit instead of half-rotted cast-offs. I took my time cooking it down, and I followed my grandmother's recipe exactly instead of cutting corners to save money." She smiled. "In other words, I made it the way it is supposed to be made." "Well, Cookie is going to lose his mind over this, and the boys will probably fight over who gets it on their biscuits." Ryder set down the jar and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small leather pouch. He counted out 5 silver dollars onto the table, the coins ringing against the wood. Zelda stared at the money. It was more cash than she had seen in one place since arriving in Circleville. $5. A fortune. "You can count it if you like," Ryder said. "I trust you." She picked up the coins, feeling the weight of them in her palm. "Thank you. This means more than you know." "I am the one who should be thanking you. This is going to make me very popular back at the ranch." He paused, then added, "Actually, I have a proposal for you if you are interested." "A proposal?" Cookie needs jam, but he also needs other things. Pickled vegetables, dried fruit, that sort of thing. The ranch has a garden, but it is not nearly big enough to feed 30 men year-round. We end up buying a lot of preserved goods from suppliers in Salt Lake City, and it is expensive. If you were willing, I think I could arrange for you to have a regular contract with the ranch. You could make whatever preserves and pickles Cookie needs, and we would pay you a fair wage for it. Zelda's mind raced. A regular contract, steady income. The possibility of actually saving money, of building something more stable than her current hand-to-mouth existence. "How much work are we talking about?" she asked carefully. "I would have to talk to Cookie and Harrison, but probably at least $50 worth of goods per month. Maybe more during harvest season." He watched her face. "I know it is a lot of work, but you would have time to plan for it. We could work out a schedule that makes sense. $50 per month." That was enough to pay her rent, buy food, save money, and still have something left over. That was security. That was a future. "I would need to expand my operation," she said slowly, thinking out loud. "I could not make that much in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen. I would need my own space, more equipment. I would need help harvesting some of the raw materials." "We could help with that," Ryder said immediately. "The ranch hands could harvest whatever you need within reason. And as for space, there is an old adobe building on the edge of the ranch property that is not being used for anything. It used to be a line shack, but we built a new one closer to the grazing lands. You could use it if you wanted, set up your operation there." It was too much, too fast. Zelda felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to step off into empty air. "Why?" she asked, echoing her question from that first day in the desert. "Why are you doing this?" Ryder was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because I know what it is like to struggle. Because when my mother died and my father fell apart, there were people who helped us. People who gave my father work when he was too drunk to deserve it, who made sure I had food even when we could not pay for it. I would not be here today without their kindness." So when I see someone working as hard as you are, bleeding in the desert for pennies, I think about what someone else did for me, and I try to do the same." It was the most she had heard him say at once, and the honesty in his voice brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She blinked them back quickly. "I accept," she said. "Your proposal I accept." His smile was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "Good, that is good. I will talk to Harrison and Cookie this week and we will work out the details. How soon could you start?" "Give me 2 weeks to get organized. I will need to go to Salt Lake City to buy equipment and supplies. And I will need to see this adobe building you mentioned, figure out what needs to be done to make it usable. I can take you out there this week if you like. And if you need money up front to buy supplies, I am sure we can arrange something. That would be helpful." Zelda hesitated, then added, "Ryder, I do not know how to thank you. This changes everything." "You do not need to thank me. Just keep making jam this good and we will call it even." He picked up the crates of jam carefully. "I should get going. Cookie is going to want to try this as soon as possible, but I will be back in a few days to take you to see the adobe building. Does that work?" "That works." She walked him out to his horse and helped him secure the crates in his saddlebags. Their fingers brushed as they worked, and Zelda felt a spark of something that had nothing to do with static electricity. Ryder must have felt it too because he went very still for a moment before continuing with the straps. "I will see you soon, Zelda." "Soon," she agreed. She watched him ride away, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating far too fast. Behind her she heard Mrs. Henderson's voice, dry with amusement. "Still think he is just being kind?" Zelda did not answer. She could not lie to Mrs. Henderson, but she was not quite ready to admit the truth to herself yet. Ryder returned 4 days later, this time with a small wagon instead of just his horse. Zelda was waiting on the porch, dressed in her most practical clothes and carrying a small bag with a notebook, pencil, and a few other necessities. "Ready to see your new workshop?" he asked as he pulled up. "More than ready." The ride south was beautiful. The landscape opened up as they left Circleville, the red rock formations giving way to rolling hills covered in sage and juniper. Cattle dotted the hillsides, grazing peacefully, and in the distance, Zelda could see the mountains rising like a jagged wall against the blue sky. Ryder kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the land. He had grown up in this territory, she learned, had spent his whole life learning its moods and secrets. He spoke about the desert with the affection of a man describing his home, because that was what it was to him. The Broken Arrow Ranch appeared gradually, starting with more frequent cattle, then a few scattered buildings, and finally the main compound. It was larger than Zelda had expected, a collection of sturdy wooden structures surrounding a central yard. There were corrals for the horses, a massive barn, a bunkhouse, a cookhouse, and a large main house that must belong to the owner. "That is Harrison's place," Ryder confirmed, following her gaze. "He is a good man, fair boss, treats his workers well and pays on time. We are lucky to work for him." He drove past the main compound and continued south for another mile. The adobe building he had mentioned sat by itself on a slight rise, overlooking a creek that ran with clear water. It was small but well built, the thick adobe walls still solid despite years of disuse. A ramada provided shade on one side, and there was a small corral nearby that might have once held horses. Ryder helped her down from the wagon, and they walked toward the building together. The door was unlocked, swinging open on leather hinges. Inside, the space was dim and cool, empty except for a few old pieces of furniture and a thick layer of dust. "It has not been used in 5 years, Ryder said, looking around. "But the roof is sound and the walls are solid. It would need cleaning and some repairs, but nothing major. Zelda walked through the space slowly, her mind already working. The main room was large enough to set up her work area, with space for a stove, tables for preparing food, and shelves for storage. There was a smaller room off to the side that might have been a bedroom, and she could use that for additional storage or for letting goods cool and rest. There is a good well nearby, Ryder continued, and the creek is reliable year-round. You would have access to plenty of water. And the ranch hands pass by here regularly, so you would not be too isolated. Zelda stepped back outside and looked at the surrounding landscape. It was peaceful here, quiet except for the sound of the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. She could imagine herself here, working in this space, building something that was truly hers. "What would I owe for using this?" she asked. "Nothing. It is just sitting empty. You would be doing us a favor by using it." He came to stand beside her, following her gaze across the landscape. "We could bring you supplies as you need them, and you could send finished goods back with whoever is riding to the main compound. It would be easy enough to coordinate." It was almost too perfect. Zelda found herself waiting for the catch, the hidden price, the thing that would make this impossible. But Ryder just stood there, patient and solid, waiting for her answer. "I will need to buy equipment," she said finally. "A good stove, proper cookware, jars, supplies. That will cost money I do not have yet. We can advance you some wages, say $50 to get started. You can work it off over the first few months. That is generous. That is practical. We need what you can make, and you need the tools to make it. Seems like a simple solution to me." He turned to face her. "So what do you say? Do we have a deal?" Zelda looked at the adobe building, at the clear running creek, at the vast sweep of sky overhead. She thought about the boarding house in Circleville, about her tiny room and the kitchen she borrowed for pennies. She thought about bleeding in the desert and counting coins that barely covered her rent. She thought about hope, about courage born of desperation, about taking chances when chances were all you had. "We have a deal," she said, and held out her hand. Ryder took it, his grip warm and firm. "Welcome to the Broken Arrow, Zelda." They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, and Zelda felt something shift inside her. This was a beginning, she realized, not just of a business arrangement, but of something more, something she was not quite ready to name. The next week was a whirlwind of activity. Ryder arranged for Zelda to travel to Salt Lake City with one of the ranch supply wagons, driven by Mateo. The older man proved to be excellent company, keeping her entertained with stories about the early days of the Broken Arrow and offering advice on what equipment she should buy. In Salt Lake City, Zelda spent the $50 advance carefully but thoroughly. She bought a good cast iron stove, a set of large copper pots, dozens of jars in various sizes, and all the small tools and implements she would need. She bought sugar in bulk, fabric for straining, and a dozen other necessities. Mateo helped her negotiate prices and load everything into the wagon. "You drive a hard bargain," he said approvingly after she had talked a merchant down from his asking price on the pots. "My wife would like you." "Will I meet her?" Zelda asked. "Of course. Maria comes to the ranch every week to visit me and bring me fresh tortillas. She will want to meet the woman who has Ryder so twisted up." Zelda nearly dropped the jar she was holding. "Twisted up?" Mateo gave her a knowing look. "That boy has not stopped talking about you since the day he found you in the desert. Zelda this, Zelda that. He rode out to check on that adobe building 3 times before you even came to look at it, making sure everything was perfect. And he convinced Harrison to approve this contract in about 5 minutes flat, which is something I have never seen him do before. Usually, Ryder is the most laid-back person you will ever meet, But when it comes to you, he is focused like I have never seen." Zelda did not know what to say to that. Part of her wanted to dismiss Mateo's observations, to insist that Ryder was just being kind, just helping someone who needed it. But another part of her, a part she had been trying very hard to ignore, felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. "He is a good man," she said finally. "The best," Mateo agreed. "Which is why I am telling you this. If you are not interested in him that way, you need to let him know, before he gets his heart set on something that is not going to happen. And if I am interested—" The words came out before she could stop them. Mateo's smile was warm. "Then I would say you picked a good man to be interested in, but you need to figure that out, and soon. Ryder is patient, but he is also proud. He will not keep putting himself out there if he thinks you do not want him to." They drove back to the ranch in thoughtful silence, and Zelda spent the time examining her own heart. Was she interested in Ryder? The honest answer was yes. She was attracted to him, certainly. His kindness, his gentle strength, the way he looked at her like she was someone worth looking at. But attraction was one thing. Anything more was complicated. She had nothing to offer him. No family, no money, no real future beyond what she could scrape together with her own 2 hands. What did she know about being a cowboy's wife, about life on a remote ranch? She had been raised in St. Louis, had lived her whole life in cities and towns. The desert was beautiful, but it was also harsh and unforgiving. And yet, when she thought about going back to Circleville, about living in that tiny room at the boarding house with no one to talk to and nothing to look forward to, her heart rebelled. She did not want that life anymore. She wanted something more, something bigger. She wanted the possibility that had started to bloom the day Ryder had ridden up and asked her the price of her jam. By the time they reached the ranch, Zelda had not resolved anything, but she had made one decision. She would be honest. With Ryder and with herself. Whatever happened next, it would be built on truth. Over the next 2 weeks, Zelda transformed the old adobe building into her workshop. Ranch hands helped her install the stove and set up the heavy equipment. She scrubbed the place from top to bottom, whitewashing the walls until they gleamed. She organized her supplies and tools, creating a space that was efficient and practical. Ryder was there almost every day, helping with the heavy work, making sure she had everything she needed. They fell into an easy partnership, working side by side, talking or staying silent as the mood suited them. Zelda found herself watching him when he was not looking, noticing the way his muscles moved under his shirt when he lifted something heavy, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he bent to his work, the sound of his laugh when she said something that amused him. She was falling for him. There was no point in denying it anymore. One evening, as the sun was setting and they were finishing up for the day, Ryder started a fire in the Ramada and produced a basket of food from the cookhouse. "I thought you might be hungry," he said. "Starving," Zelda admitted. She had been working since dawn and had forgotten to eat lunch. They sat together in the fading light, eating cold chicken and fresh bread and passing a canteen of water between them. The desert was beautiful at this hour, all gold and orange and purple, the colors shifting as the sun sank lower. "I love this time of day," Ryder said quietly. "When the work is done and everything is peaceful, makes all the hard parts worth it. I can see why." Zelda finished her chicken and wiped her hands on a cloth. "Ryder, can I ask you something? Anything? Why are you really doing all this? And please do not tell me it is just about the jam or helping someone who needed it. I think it is more than that." He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "You are right. It is more than that." He set down his food and turned to face her fully. In the dying light, his hazel eyes were dark and serious. "I saw you in the desert that day, bleeding and determined and so alone, and I thought, There is a woman who deserves better, who deserves someone to see how hard she is working and value it. I wanted to be that someone." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "And then I got to know you, and I realized it was not just about helping someone in need. You are smart and strong, and you do not complain even when you have every right to. You make the best jam I have ever tasted because you care about doing things right. You are building a future for yourself from nothing but will and hard work. That is rare, Zelda. That is special." Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Ryder, I am not asking you for anything," he said quickly. "I know you have a lot on your mind right now, getting your business started. And I know I am just a cowboy with not much to offer except hard work and an honest heart. But I wanted you to know how I feel, so there are no misunderstandings between us." Zelda had spent her whole life being practical, being cautious, protecting herself from disappointment. But sitting here in the desert sunset with this good man who saw her, really saw her, she found that she was tired of being careful. "You are not just a cowboy," she said. "You are kind and generous, and you make me laugh. You saw me when I was at my lowest, and you did not judge me or pity me. You just helped, and you have kept helping without asking for anything in return. That is not nothing, Ryder. That is everything." Hope flared in his eyes. "Does that mean?" "It means I am interested," she said, echoing Mateo's words from the wagon. "It means I think about you more than I probably should. It means that when you are around, everything seems easier somehow. Better." Ryder reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she did not, he took her hand in his, careful of the still healing scars from the prickly pear thorns. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you will let me. I know we are doing everything backwards, starting with business before friendship before romance. But I would like to do this right. Take you to town socials, introduce you to people as my girl, let everyone know that I think you are special." "Your girl," Zelda repeated, testing the words. They felt strange and wonderful at the same time. "If you want to be." She thought about all the reasons this was complicated, about the business arrangement they had, about the fact that she barely knew him really, about all the ways it could go wrong. And then she thought about the way her heart felt when he smiled at her, about the way she felt safe and valued when he was around, about the fact that she had been alone for so long and had forgotten what it felt like to have someone care. "I want to be," she said. His smile was brilliant, transforming his whole face. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, careful to avoid the scars. "Thank you. You have made me very happy." They sat together as the stars came out, holding hands and talking about small things and large things and everything in between. Zelda told him about her mother, about growing up in St. Louis, about the dreams she had once had that had died with her mother's illness. Ryder told her about his childhood, about losing his mother young, about learning to cowboy from men who had been patient with a grieving boy. "I want to give you things," he said eventually. "Stability, a home, a future. But I know you value your independence, and I respect that. So we will go slow, figure out how this works with your business and my work. We will make it up as we go." "I like that," Zelda said. "Making it up as we go, that seems right somehow." When Ryder finally drove her back to Circleville that night, he walked her to the door of the boarding house like a proper gentleman. He did not try to kiss her, though she could see in his eyes that he wanted to. Instead, he squeezed her hand and promised to come by in 2 days. Mrs. Henderson was waiting in the parlor when Zelda came inside. "Well, well, what?" Zelda tried to keep her voice neutral, but she could not stop smiling. "Do not play coy with me, girl. I saw the way that Cowboy looked at you when he brought you home. Like you were the answer to every prayer he ever prayed, so I will ask again. Well, "He is courting me," Zelda said, and the words felt like magic. "Properly courting me. He said I was special." Mrs. Henderson's stern face softened into something like fondness. "You are special, foolish girl. About time someone told you so. Now, come have some tea and tell me everything." True to his word, Ryder began courting Zelda properly. He took her to a dance in Circleville, where she met more people in one night than she had in 3 months of living there. With Ryder beside her, introducing her as his girl, the townsfolk suddenly saw her differently. She was not the strange outsider anymore. She was Ryder Bennett's girl, and that meant something. He took her on rides through the desert, showing her places of startling beauty. Hidden canyons where wildflowers bloomed, springs that bubbled up from the red rock, ancient cliff dwellings that spoke of people who had lived here long before any of them. He shared his world with her, piece by piece, and Zelda fell in love with it. She fell in love with him too, slowly and then all at once. She loved the way he treated her like an equal, respecting her opinions and asking her advice. She loved the way he made her laugh, finding humor in the small frustrations of daily life. She loved his quiet strength, the way he could gentle a frightened horse or defend someone being treated unfairly with equal ease. She loved the way he looked at her, like she was precious and strong at the same time. Her business thrived. Cookie at the Broken Arrow became her biggest customer, ordering not just jam but pickled vegetables, dried fruit, and preserved meat. Word spread, and soon she was getting orders from other ranches, from the restaurant in Beaver that Mrs. Henderson's son ran, even from some of the shops in larger towns. She hired help, training 2 young women from Circleville who needed work. She taught them her grandmother's recipes, showed them how to preserve food properly, how to recognize quality ingredients. The old adobe building hummed with activity, and Zelda found herself building something she had never expected. A real business, a future, a life. Ryder was there through all of it, helping when she needed it, stepping back when she did not, always supporting but never controlling. They settled into a rhythm that felt natural and right. 6 months after that first meeting in the desert, Ryder asked her to marry him. They were sitting by the creek near her workshop, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. He had been quiet all day, and Zelda had sensed something was on his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice was nervous in a way she had never heard before. "Zelda, I have been thinking." "That sounds dangerous," she teased gently. "I am serious." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I love you. I have loved you since the day I saw you in the desert, bleeding for pennies and too stubborn to quit. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you make the best jam in the territory. I love the way you laugh at my bad jokes and the way you look when you are concentrating on something. I love everything about you." Zelda's breath caught. They had said those words before, quiet declarations whispered in stolen moments, but this felt different, more formal, more important. "I am just a cowboy," Ryder continued. "I do not have much to offer except hard work and a heart that is completely yours, but I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life together, whatever that looks like. So I am asking you, Zelda Morgan, will you marry me?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It was simple, a silver band with a small turquoise stone set in it. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "The only thing I have of hers. My father gave it to me before he died, said I should give it to a woman who was strong enough to wear it. I cannot think of anyone stronger than you." Tears were streaming down Zelda's face, happy tears that she made no effort to hide. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you. Nothing would make me happier." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then, finally, he kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise, and Zelda felt like her heart might burst from happiness. They were married 2 months later in a simple ceremony at the church in Circleville. Mrs. Henderson cried, which surprised everyone, including herself. Mateo stood up as Ryder's best man, and his wife Maria, who Zelda had indeed met and liked immediately, stood up for Zelda. Harrison Fletcher, the owner of the Broken Arrow, gave them a week off as a wedding gift, and they spent it at the ranch, in a small house that Harrison had quietly arranged to have built for them on the property. It was a good life they built together. Zelda continued to run her preserves business, which grew steadily. Ryder continued to work for the Broken Arrow, rising to the position of foreman when Mateo retired 3 years after their wedding. They worked hard and they played hard, finding joy in the small things and comfort in each other. A year after their wedding, Zelda discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with a mixture of joy and terror. Zelda thought about her mother, about all the women in her family line who had passed down recipes and traditions and love. She thought about the child growing inside her, about the future they were building. Their son was born in the spring of 1885, during a thunderstorm that shook the little house. He came into the world squalling and healthy, with his father's hazel eyes and his mother's determination. They named him Samuel, after Mrs. Henderson's son, who had written the letter about Circleville that had brought Zelda west in the first place. Samuel was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Martha, after Zelda's mother. Martha had Ryder's dark hair and Zelda's fierce spirit. She came into the world during a snowstorm, quiet and watchful, already taking the measure of her surroundings. Zelda taught her children the old recipes, showing them how to work with prickly pear and other desert plants. She told them about their great-grandmother, about the traditions that had been passed down through the women of their family. Ryder taught them to ride and rope, to read the land and the weather, to treat all people with respect and kindness. The business continued to grow. By 1890, Zelda was employing 15 people and supplying preserves and pickled goods to ranches and restaurants across southern Utah and into Nevada. She opened a small shop in Circleville, run by one of her most trusted employees, and later another in Beaver. She never forgot where she had come from, never forgot the feeling of bleeding in the desert for pennies. She hired women who needed work, especially those who were alone or struggling. She paid them fair wages and taught them skills they could use. She created opportunities the way Ryder had created an opportunity for her, understanding that sometimes all a person needed was someone to believe in them. Mrs. Henderson became a beloved grandmother figure to their children, teaching them to bake and telling them stories about their mother when she had first arrived in Circleville, alone and determined. Mateo and Maria were frequent visitors, and their own children became playmates for Samuel and Martha. The little house on the Broken Arrow Ranch expanded over the years, growing room by room as the family and the business both flourished. Ryder and Zelda added a proper kitchen for her work, then a second story with more bedrooms. They added a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset paint the desert in gold and orange. Life was not always easy. There were droughts that killed cattle and ruined crops. There were seasons when the preserves business struggled and money was tight. There were illnesses and injuries, disappointments and sorrows. But through it all, they had each other. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ryder surprised Zelda with a day off. He arranged for Maria to watch the children and took Zelda on a ride into the desert, back to the place where he had first found her harvesting prickly pear with bleeding hands. "I wanted to come back here," he said, as they stood together looking at the cactus patches. "To remember how it all started. Zelda looked at her hands, scarred but strong, no longer stained purple but marked permanently by the thorns that had pierced them so long ago. Those scars were a reminder of a different time, a different person. She had been so alone then, so desperate. And now she was anything but. "I was so scared that day," she admitted. "Scared of the future, scared I was going to fail, scared I would end up with nothing. And then you rode up and asked me to name a fair price. You changed everything." "You changed everything," Ryder corrected. "You were already strong, already determined. I just saw it and valued it the way you deserved to be valued." "We changed everything together," Zelda said, taking his hand. "You helped me and I loved you for it. But more than that, you saw me. You saw past the blood and the desperation to who I really was. That was the real gift." They kissed there in the desert where it had all begun, and it felt like coming full circle. From bleeding and desperate to loved and secure, from pennies to prosperity, from alone to together. It was a good story, Zelda thought. The kind of story worth telling. As the years passed, the story only got better. Samuel grew into a young man who combined his mother's business sense with his father's skill with horses. At 20, he started his own horse breeding operation on Broken Arrow land, with Harrison Fletcher's blessing and his parents' support. He married a kind young woman named Sarah, and they gave Zelda and Ryder 3 grandchildren who filled the house with noise and laughter. Martha followed in her mother's footsteps, taking over more and more of the preserve's business as Zelda gradually stepped back. She had her mother's gift for flavors and her father's ability to read people, knowing exactly what they needed before they knew it themselves. She expanded the business even further, eventually opening a shop in Salt Lake City that catered to the growing city's appetite for high-quality preserved goods. By 1900, Zelda and Ryder were in their early 40s, with grown children and a legacy that stretched across the territory. They had built something that mattered, not just in financial terms but in human terms. The women Zelda had trained and employed over the years had gone on to start their own businesses, to support their own families, to build their own futures. The kindness Ryder had shown her had rippled outward, creating waves of opportunity and hope. On a warm evening in late summer, they sat together on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Samuel's oldest boy was teaching his younger siblings to rope fence posts, with mixed success. The air was full of laughter and the sweet smell of sage. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you had ridden past that day?" Zelda asked. "If you had not stopped to ask about the prickly pear?" Ryder considered the question seriously. "I think you would have found another way. You were too determined to fail. Maybe it would have taken longer, been harder, but you would have made it. Maybe, but I am glad I did not have to find out." She leaned against him, fitting into his side the way she had learned to do over 17 years of marriage. "I am glad you stopped. Glad you asked me to name a fair price." "Best business deal I ever made," Ryder said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "It was not really about business, though, was it?" "No," he admitted. "It was never about business. From the moment I saw you bleeding and proud and refusing to quit, I was lost. I just did not know it yet." "I knew," Zelda said, "or at least I hoped. That hope was the first thing I felt after my mother died that was not grief or fear. You gave me hope, Ryder, and then you gave me so much more." As the sun set and the children were called inside for supper, Zelda thought about that young woman in the desert, harvesting prickly pear with bleeding hands. She thought about how far she had come, about the life she had built. Not alone, but with a partner who saw her and valued her and loved her exactly as she was. She thought about the fair price Ryder had asked her to name that day. At the time, she had said 20 cents per jar, thinking it was more than she could hope for. But the real price, the fair price, had been so much more than money. It had been trust and partnership, love and loyalty, a future built together one day at a time. And as they sat together watching the stars come out over the Utah desert, Zelda knew that whatever price they had paid, whatever challenges they had faced, it had all been worth it. Every thorn, every drop of blood, every moment of fear and doubt had led her here to this place, with this man, surrounded by the family and the life they had created together. It was more than fair. It was everything. The years continued to unfold with grace and purpose. Harrison Fletcher, who had been like a father to Ryder and a steadfast supporter of Zelda's business ventures, passed away peacefully in 1905. In his will, he left the Broken Arrow Ranch not to distant relatives but to Ryder, whom he had named as his son in all but blood. The gesture moved Ryder to tears, and he vowed to honor Harrison's legacy by running the ranch with the same integrity and fairness that Harrison had modeled. Under Ryder's leadership, the Broken Arrow continued to thrive. He implemented many of the progressive ideas he and Zelda had discussed over the years, improving conditions for the ranch hands, ensuring fair wages, and creating a profit-sharing system that gave the men who worked the land a stake in its success. The ranch became known throughout the territory as a model operation, and Ryder's reputation as a fair and skilled rancher spread far beyond Utah's borders. Zelda's business, now officially called Morgan's Preserves after she decided to keep her maiden name for the company, became one of the largest preserve and pickle producers in the region. Martha ran the day-to-day operations with skill and innovation, but Zelda remained involved, offering guidance and occasionally developing new recipes that became instant favorites. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1909, their children and grandchildren threw them a celebration that brought together people from all across southern Utah. Mrs. Henderson, now in her 80s but still sharp as a tack, gave a speech that had everyone laughing and crying in equal measure. "I remember when Zelda first came to my boarding house," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. "She was this skinny, sad girl with nothing but a carpet bag and her mother's recipes. I did not think she would last a month in Circleville. Too soft for the desert, I thought. Too refined for hard work." She paused, looking directly at Zelda. "I have never been more wrong about anything in my life." This woman built an empire from prickly pear and determination. And when that cowboy saw what she was doing and decided to help her, well, that was the start of something beautiful. She raised her glass. "To Zelda and Ryder, may they have 25 more years of happiness together." Everyone drank, and Zelda felt tears streaming down her face. She looked around at the gathered crowd, at the faces of people she loved, people she had helped, people who had become family in the truest sense of the word. This was her legacy, she realized. Not just the business or the recipes, but the community they had built, the lives they had touched, the kindness they had spread. Ryder stood and held out his hand to her. "Dance with me, wife. Always husband." They danced together as the sun set over the desert, surrounded by love and laughter and the life they had built together. Zelda rested her head against Ryder's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, that reliable rhythm that had been her comfort and her home for 25 years. "Do you remember what I asked you that day?" Ryder murmured into her hair. "When I found you with the prickly pear, you asked me to name a fair price. And you did. 20 cents per jar. But I think we both know that was not the real question I was asking." Zelda pulled back to look at him, seeing the love and mischief in his hazel eyes. "What were you really asking?" "I was asking what it would cost to be part of your life. What price I would have to pay to earn your trust, your respect, maybe eventually your love. I was asking what was fair. And what did you decide? That no price was too high, that I would pay whatever it took, do whatever was necessary, to prove to you that you deserved better than bleeding in the desert for pennies, that you deserved someone who saw your worth. Zelda felt new tears threatening. Even after all these years, Ryder could still make her cry with his words. You never stopped paying that price, she said. Every day you show me that you value me. Every day you prove that your love was not a one-time thing but a choice you keep making. Because it is the easiest choice I have ever made, Ryder said simply. Loving you is like breathing, essential, automatic, the thing that keeps me alive. They kissed there under the stars, and it felt both familiar and new, a promise renewed and strengthened by time and trial. Around them, their family and friends cheered, and the music played on, and the desert night wrapped them all in its ancient embrace. As the years rolled forward into the 1910s, Zelda and Ryder settled into the comfortable rhythms of a long and successful marriage. They were grandparents now, watching their grandchildren grow and begin their own journeys into adulthood. Samuel's oldest son, named Ryder after his grandfather, showed a talent for business and began working with his Aunt Martha to expand Morgan's preserves into new markets. The younger children were still finding their paths, but all of them showed the same combination of strength and kindness that their grandparents had modeled. Zelda began writing down the old recipes, not just the ones for preserves, but all the traditions her mother and grandmother had passed down to her. She wrote about the proper way to harvest prickly pear, about reading the desert seasons, about the herbs and plants that had sustained her ancestors. She wrote about the importance of fair wages and treating people with dignity, about building businesses that served the community rather than just extracting profit from it. I want them to remember, she told Ryder one evening as she worked on her writing. Not just the recipes, but the why behind them, the values that matter. They will remember, Ryder assured her, because you are not just writing it down, you are living it, and they see that every day. In 1915, on a crisp autumn morning, Zelda and Ryder rode out to the old adobe building where she had first established her business. It was still in use, though Martha had built a much larger facility closer to town for the main production. But this place remained special, a touchstone for their story. They stood together looking at the building, at the creek still running clear beside it, at the vast sweep of desert stretching to the horizon. Zelda's hair was gray now, and Ryder's face was deeply weathered by decades in the sun. But when they looked at each other, they saw the same people they had always been, the determined young woman with bleeding hands, the kind cowboy who had stopped to help. I am grateful, Zelda said simply, for all of it, the hard parts and the easy parts, the struggles and the triumphs. I am grateful that you stopped that day, grateful that you saw me. I am grateful that you let me into your life, Ryder replied, that you trusted me enough to take a chance, that you built something beautiful and let me be part of it. They stood there as the sun climbed higher, holding hands as they had held hands 1,000 times before, drawing strength and comfort from each other as they always had. The desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying with it the smell of dust and growing things, of possibility and promise. This was their legacy, Zelda thought. Not just the business or the ranch, but this partnership built on respect and trust and love that had endured through everything life had thrown at them. This choice to keep choosing each other, day after day, year after year, through joy and sorrow, prosperity and challenge. This was the fair price. Not 20 cents per jar of jam, but 2 lives intertwined, supporting each other, lifting each other up, creating something together that neither could have created alone. As they rode back to the ranch house that afternoon, Zelda thought about that young woman she had been, so afraid and alone, thinking that survival was the best she could hope for. She wished she could go back and tell that young woman that help was coming, that love was possible, that the thorns and the blood were not the end of the story but the beginning. She wished she could tell her that the cowboy who stopped to ask about her jam would become her husband, her partner, her home, that he would give her not just fair wages but a fair chance at happiness, that together they would build something that mattered, something that would outlast them both. But she could not go back, could only go forward, and forward was good. Forward was Ryder beside her, their grandchildren waiting at home, the business thriving, the ranch prospering, a community strengthened by the kindness they had tried to model. Forward was sunset over the desert they both loved, stars coming out one by one, another day completed, another night beginning. Forward was the future they had built, one choice at a time, one act of kindness rippling outward into the world. The story that had begun with bleeding hands and prickly pear jam had become a story about so much more, about seeing people for who they really were, about naming fair prices and honoring them, about building partnerships based on respect and love that could weather any storm. It was a good story, Zelda thought as they reached home, and Ryder helped her down from her horse with the same gentle care he had shown 30 years ago. A story worth living, a story worth remembering, a story that would be passed down through generations, along with the recipes and the traditions and the values that mattered most. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set once again over the desert landscape, their grandchildren playing in the yard, the sounds of family and life surrounding them, Zelda squeezed Ryder's hand and said the words she had said 1,000 times before, and would say 1,000 times more. "I love you. I love you too," Ryder replied, as he always did, would always do until the day one of them was no longer there to say it. Always have, always will. And as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, Zelda Morgan Bennett felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived, of love freely given and generously returned, of a price named and paid with joy rather than obligation. She had picked prickly pear with bleeding hands, desperate for pennies to survive. The cowboy had said to name a fair price. And in naming it, in accepting his help, in building a partnership, and then a love that transformed them both, she had discovered that the fairest price of all was the one paid in trust, in respect, in the daily choice to honor and value another person. It was a price she had paid gladly. A price they both had paid and would continue to pay for all the days they had left. Because that was what love was in the end. Not a single dramatic gesture, but 1,000 small choices, 1,000 acts of kindness, 1,000 moments of seeing and being seen. The story that had started in the desert with thorns and blood had become a story of hope and healing, of community and legacy, of two people who had found each other when they most needed to be found. And though the story would eventually end, as all stories must, the impact of it would continue, rippling forward through time in the lives they had touched and the values they had modeled and the love they had shared so freely. That was the true fair price. That was the real value of what they had built, not measured in dollars or jars of jam, but in lives changed, in hope restored, in kindness passed forward from one generation to the next. And as Zelda sat there with Ryder's hand in hers, surrounded by the family and the life they had created together, she knew with absolute certainty that it had all been worth it. Every thorn, every drop of blood, every moment of fear and doubt had led her here to this perfect moment of peace and gratitude. The desert had tested her, and she had survived. The cowboy had helped her, and she had loved him. Together they had built something beautiful. And that was the best story of all.